Just to start with introducing myself, I am born in Nagoya, Japan. I lived in different countries throughout my life, and just like Joe said, I started TPS consultant like 20 years ago, 20 plus years ago, and from the beginning of my career as a TPS, Toyota Production System consultant, my boss was always my father, Hajime Oba. He is a former Toyota employee since the 70s, and he worked in the TPS group, not directly under Taichi Ono, who was the starter of the TPS system, but first generation TPS consultant people was always his teacher. And in 1992, he moved to United States, to Lexington, Kentucky, to start the Toyota Supplier Support Center, which was the organization that Toyota created to coach Toyota production system to basically any companies. That any company means he did a lot of business with like hospitals. He also helped community service centers and a lot of different like small scale governments, education institutions, stuff like that. And when he retired from Toyota in 2008, he was passionate about continuing this TPS consultation business. So he started the H&M operations management, which is where I am working right now. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple years ago, but I'm trying to spread what I learned from him through this TPS activities. And one of the core lessons that I learned from my father through this TPS activity, he's very cautious about every word that he uses. And he always challenged me that we have a mutual understanding of what we are talking about on the shop floor. We call it the gemba, because every word has different interpretation, and unless we fully understand what we are talking about in the reality, we won't come to a mutual conclusion, our understanding of each other. So he continuously challenged me, why are you using that word? What does it mean on the shop floor? And we always had really fun conversation around it. And for today purpose, I'm not gonna rush through the TPS, house of TPS or that kind of thing. But I'm gonna stick to some of the few words that I got stuck with him, trying to understand each other on what does he mean by management, because I think that's a critical word that we discuss so many times. So just to explain the root of Toyota production system, I think a lot of academics will suggest that the root of the Toyota production comes from the Frederick Taylor and his book Scientific Management, which was published in the early 20th centuries. And that came to Japan. It actually came quite early. By the teen age of 20th centuries, we already had translations of his book. And Ono also claims that he started reading these books before starting TPS. And that provided him the foundation knowledge of what is standard work. And he started implementing those ideas before he jumped to some of the important TPS tools, such as just-in-time productions and Kanbans and flows. And my boss always challenged is understand that change or flow of information, right? He will say, read the original scientific management and understand how it's been translated in Japanese. What are the differences and how it changed? Because there's no way that two gentlemen that lived actually only, so Ono was 3 years old when Mr. Taylor died. So there's no way two of them can directly communicate to each other. There must be a lot of interpretation in between that causes the difference. And unless we understand the change in those word perception, we might not come to a mutual understanding. And one of the first word was management. And when this word management, I'm not sure if it was introduced before Taylor or not, but when it was introduced to Japan, frankly speaking, the Japanese was completely confused because we didn't have a word that can describe the word management. So what we did is we tried to understand the root of that word, and it's manage comes from a Latin word of manual, hand, and sometimes it also means like how to control the horses. and things like that became the word management. It just confuses us Japanese. So we said, okay, let's just come up with some words that probably understand, interpret that word. Two words came up as management was KA and Kanban. Both of these Japanese words are used inside TPS. For example, work-based management, the second book the owner produced is saying Genba KA. So they're using the word KA to describe what kind of activity they should be doing on the shop floor. At the same time, we also frequently use this word Kanban. And for example, quality control, that's another influence that we had at the time. QC activity that started from US was translated as Kanban, but this word also means management too for us. So we have this connection, two words that we conveniently use. And my boss started to challenge me, okay, when do we use KA? When do we use Kanban? Because the notion of these two differences might be critical for us to explain what 2PS is. And if I look at the background of this word KA, it comes from this four symbols in China, where this was a king that was trying to make a new building. He said that we need to build the milestones, and then we distribute the activity among the people. And what's important in this symbol is the first symbol, and this symbol has originally mean a vertical thread. And vertical thread doesn't mean anything, but then the Confucians started to use this word to describe the vertical relationship inside a family, from grandfather, father, son, to the grandchildren. This generational connection of a family is called K in this. And that's what the centerpiece of the Confucian thinking. And therefore, there's 5 books that is critically important for this religion, and those 5 books is called the 5 Ks and the Confucian. The other thing is the Buddhism also used this symbol K, and it usually means sutra. A sutra is like a phrase or something that Buddha said that describes the core value of his teachings, and therefore we must practice that every day. And K is extremely, how can I say, Eastern philosophically important word that describes this human relationship and also this philosophical thinking behind the Buddhism's be nice to people kind of attitude is hidden in this word, and practicing that K is important part of management. And therefore, I always say it is a guiding principle to reach higher level. There's other words that we use this word K. For example, economy is called keizai, which means to save the people, which is completely different from what economy originally come from. But at that time in the early 20th centuries, when Japanese people start to be introduced to this economy or management thinking, they start to say, hey, that's the thinking that connects to Confucians or Buddhism. Thinking of saving the people and guiding the people to a higher level is the true objective of management, which I'm not saying that's right or wrong, that's how we perceive it. Another word is called kanri, and this word also comes from China, of this kankatsu, whatever the way it's by. Basically, it means administration and administration. So it's a very bureaucratic word, and that's why it's typically tied to control. And that's why when you use the word quality control, it means to strictly control the quality aspect of business. And that's why sometimes we use the word shop floor control or shop floor control board is to create a controlled mechanism to make sure that the performance of the shop floor is always stable. But then when I try to understand, so how does this work in this TPS? And when I talk about the structure of this, is there's always this strict control part. And there's also this KA part, which is somewhat more vague and open and flexible. And they seem to be, Toyota guys, when they explain TPS, they seem to be conveniently changing these words. When it translates to English, it might be the same word, management, But there are people who are more responsible on controls, and there are people who are more responsible on management of the situation. And we try to separate the two. And that's hidden behind this word management. Now I'm going to come up with a lot of different examples of that kind of story. And another example of that is when Ono wrote the book, The Toyota Production System in 1975, and I have a copy right here of the Japanese version. There's a lot of word system is used inside the book, of course, right? It's the title of the book. We're talking about the system. But then when I look deeper into this Japanese version, 2 Japanese words was used and translated as system. One was hoshiki, and the other was shikumi. And I originally thought there's no difference in these two. It's okay to keep translating as a system. But one day I was challenged with my boss, and I was looking at the root of a lot of things. Then I came to a discovery that the people that I'm talking about, the first generation and the leaders, original leaders of Toyota as a motor company, I started to recognize that all these people has a mechanical engineering background. I should say both. There's one empty blank at Mr. Suzumura's place, but he's also a mechanical engineer too. So most of these people have an educational background in mechanical engineering. And when I dig the mechanical engineering, they don't translate both words as system. Hoshiki is translated as system, and shikumi is translated as mechanism. And when that happened, it clicked into my mind because when Ono is in this book, when he's using the word shikumi, it's typically talking about the mechanism, something that requires a more strict control. At the same time, the production system is a little bit more vague. And some of the, not just owner, but some of the authors are talking about this flexibility that it has in the system, which the manager have to manage. A similar structure that I saw in management exists in this comparison between the system and the mechanism, right? It's always this double loop structure that they always have. And we shouldn't mix the intentional separating these two, and they taking different approaches on each of the items. A perfect example of that is a Kanban, right? A Kanban is a word that Ono started, and it's spreading everywhere, but there's a lot of wrong interpretations. Ono wrote in the book about the 6 rules of Kanban, and if I understand this properly, these are the rules for the Kanban mechanism to function properly. The customer pulls the process from the supplier process. You cannot push it. They only produce what the quantity that was required by the Kanban. No Kanban, no transportation, no production, and Kanban is always attached to the materials. It needs 100% good product. All these things. The last one might be a little bit systematic issues, but most of it is very mechanism issue. And there's a lot of people asking me this question, like, how do you calculate the number of Kanban? And I always say, why are you asking that question? Because the only thing I know is lead time divided by takt time. That should give us how many Kanbans I require. It's a very simple equation. But then I start reading a lot of different books, and then they start adding a lot of mysterious numbers to it, like safety margins and I don't know, allowances, and all kind of mysterious numbers are added by some of the people. And that's because they're trying to combine the system aspect. And Toyota is not saying Kanban is inflexible to some of the problems. And that's what they are saying, that Kanban function is an automatic nerve. And a lot of different people said, for example, during the winter time, we add Kanban to those materials that coming from a snowy area. Why? Because we have a risk of snow, and the transportation or the production in those areas might get stuck. Therefore, I add more Kanbans during that period. But I do not add that Kanban on a regular Kanban system, a mechanism. I keep it as a system to say, okay, I want to add the safety Kanbans only to those suppliers that coming from snowy distance. Therefore, that should cover the risk of delays. And this is something that happens a lot. A recent case was the semiconductor case, right? And when the semiconductor shortage happened a couple of years ago in the automotive industry, people find out that Toyota was keeping a lot of inventory of semiconductors, and that's why they had the least downtime. And some of the analysts would start saying, oh, they destroyed the just-in-time system. But I would say, no, that's not true, because they knew that the suppliers of the semiconductors are going down. Therefore, they rely on one or two suppliers. That means they are exposed to a high risk that if something happened, in this case, the fire happened in the semiconductor factory, the entire supply chain will stop. Therefore, the risk is too high. Therefore, I need to keep additional inventory for that particular reason. They never said increase the inventory of everything because something could happen. In most of the part of the supply chain, the mechanism function with the minimum amount of inventories, and it's okay with that. But in this particular case, they highlighted the risk is extremely high in this case. In that case, let's keep the inventory. Let's not mix those two. So safety stock for some kind of systematic issues, we keep it. And then we also keep the buffer stock. When the market acts differently from what the levelized condition that we expected, we try to cover with a buffer stock. Again, don't put that in the buffer stock into the calculations. We separate it and make sure the responsible parties, the salespeople, can handle those issues. So we always have the separation between mechanism and the system, and we manage accordingly. Now I'm going to touch about something about the kata, because I think it's an interesting discussion that happened in Japan after the bubble crisis. And a lot of academics, especially those of people who from the knowledge management people like the Dr. Nonaka, start to say that the failure of the Japanese economy after the 92 bubble crash, 91, 92, is because the Japanese company was stuck with the Japanese kata that's guaranteed their success for since the mid-50s. They clinged on to it. And that's why when the market changed, they couldn't shift their capability toward a new level. But Nonaka and those guys start to say, but some companies like Toyota had not only kata, but they also had a bar, which is a free stage, which they allowed people to interact, to come up with new ideas to improve the kata. So they started calling, I think Nonaka highlighted there's like 4 different kinds of bar that could exist where the idea originated. Then they dialogue with a different party, and they trying to externalize those ideas, systemizing, and then they execute those new ideas. This kind of bar was created in some companies such as Toyota, Nonaka used, and that allowed the TPS to evolve as well as a lot of different systems. For example, when Toyota started opening up and trying to move to the TPS to United States, they didn't just copy and paste everything. They somewhat modified these TPS, not necessarily touching the core philosophies, but they adjusted the model according to the needs of each area. Just to give one example, in the 90s, PS uses the team leader system, right? Every 4 to 6 operator, we have a team leader, and the team leader will provide the support, they provide the training to the people, they do Kaizen, and it's a very critical position. But in the 90s, somehow they stopped that system in Japan. Why? Because the Japanese population was aging and the factory was aging, but they kept the team leader system in the United States because they thought that's probably the most simplest, easiest way of executing TPS. So let's keep that kata in United States. But because the Japanese populations are aging and we have more senior operators than they can raise, let's abolish the team leader system. And in the end, they compare the success and failure of those two systems, and they keeping the team leader is better. So in the mid-20s, they went back to the team leader system in Japan too. But that shows that even with this team leader system, which I thought was a rigid kata of Toyota, they had the flexibility to change that according to the condition, experimented, and after time, they re-evaluate the system and say, okay, that was a mistake, which is fine. Let's go back to the old way. And what we found out is that if we don't have a team leader, who's going to help who becomes very unclear. Who's going to do Kaizen becomes unclear. And therefore, it's better to have a team leader system. The only thing I would challenge with this knowledge management, I think, is if I talk to a lot of people like my father, he will say, yeah, because don't separate those four into a separate bars. Keep them as one bar, which is the game bar. Just go to the shop floor and always try to come up with way of creating this mixture of generating ideas or exchange of ideas and systemizing and executing on Gemba. And one of the things he always said is don't just work with TBS people or grab the engineers and ask them to come to the shop floor, invite the human resource to come to the shop floor, invite quality people, whatever. Everybody should come to the Gemba, work together, and mix these ideas to generate a new kata is what he was always trying to accomplish, and he did not hesitate a single second to do that. And he always loved involving a lot of people to the shop floor. And I think that's somewhat the interesting part of Toyota's management system is this separation of the system and the mechanism. And mechanism is usually very strict. They have a very strict standard, very strict, how can I say? Everything is quite strict. But if the moment there is a problem, just put the arm down and let the system take care of, right? Immediately somebody will come and help. But I don't mind stopping the line because our mechanism was wrong. I'm sorry, we gave you the wrong mechanism, right? That's why we have a deviation. We have a problem. You feel free to stop it. And then the system will take care of it to problem solve and improve further. And that was the interesting thing about a lot of discussion I saw with my father and a lot of different managers is like we typically think of everything as a system too much. The mechanism is not clear. And because the mechanism is not clear, we don't know how much extra labor or extra manpower we have. And because of that, we immediately jump to conclusion that, oh, we need more people to do Kaizen activity, improvement activity, because everybody is somewhat tied to the current situations. He will say, well, implement the standardized work and take up all these extra people. Now, don't fire them, reallocate them to do more Kaizens. And that was how he was managing the situation in a lot of different places. And it always starts with this balanced view of system and a mechanism and how can both happen on the shop floor and they interact. So that was something that I learned from him through TPS implementation about management where they have the double layer or double loop system.
One of the things when I stumbled across Kata was obviously the book to it you mentioned by Mike Rother was that Kata is like Toyota Kata. The book was called Toyota Kata. What was very interesting was that was obviously a publisher's choice to label the book like this. It's not, and Mike was very clear about this to say that this is not necessarily something that doesn't really necessarily exist at Toyota, but it's the thinking process of the organization that was extracted in what's now known the improvement kata and coaching kata. However, and I like that also in your slide when you mentioned like knowledge work, right? Where you said, okay, this is all about knowledge work. And if we're looking at agile ways of working, knowledge work, like you mentioned, like Kanban and with the Kanban card, I would assume, right? Is that from a productions perspective? Many of agile folks are using Kanban for knowledge work, and we refer to that as the Kanban method, something a little bit different there. But the agile ways of working, when agile teams are working with that, I saw huge potential for teams to use that kind of thinking of kata for an agile transformation. And as you just said, like with the bar, for example, where you shape and reshape the way of how you operate and even using your kata, is something like you would say as an organization, we are going to create our own way of transforming. So we are currently living in an agile world of frameworks, of methodologies, and obviously no organization is going to transform in the exact same way as the other organization. So the kata pattern I found extremely intriguing because the kata itself is just a pattern. It's a very simple pattern of navigating through possibly change within an organization. That could be a transformation for a company A. This could be a transformation for a company B. And they might actually create over time, and this is the goal really, to create their own flavor of kata over time. So it's a starting point.
So maybe let me add one thing, because one of the things my father used to say is like when you create a bar, you don't want somebody who doesn't have a kata. joining, right? You want somebody with a different kata joining the bar,
Yeah.
create intentional conflict between different thinkers. For
Yes.
example, one of my father's best friend is a quality assurance manager, and he will say, okay, this guy, the total TPS guy, right? They will come in and try to highlight the problem as much as possible. But my job as a quality manager is no matter how hard the TPS guy trying to find a problem, they won't see a single problem because everything is assured, which
Mhm.
is a different kata than TPS, because we all say there was always a problem and there was a way to highlight it. But these two was constantly on the game fighting, and they want to get drunk. They will start talking
Right.
about all kind of the two of them made, but mutually they will raise the level to a new higher level because their expectation is very high.
Mhm.
How the model grew.
Yeah, exactly. So what I think this kind of thinking, not only kata as a starting point, but also what you're saying, like creating that space where you can improve your kata itself, that is a huge opportunity for anyone in the agile community to shape the way of how you want to work in the future, right? So learning, change, how to change. And for that, it's a really great starting point. But it's very important to say it is a starting point. It's a universal, I call it a universal pattern for continuous improvement of agility, because it fits in possibly any, I have not met the limitations yet, into any area: business agility, transformational agility, team agility, just like a quick improvement a team might have. The kata could be a great tool. I think something we are lacking within our community. And I have shown this a few times in previous webinars. I'm just going to run through for everybody who might not have seen this. It's just from an improvement kata's perspective, and I'm going to link it back to your topic, Hide, is it's basically what Mike Rother has identified as the improvement kata. It's a 4-step pattern, right? To identify where is the direction. Behind that blue arrow is the time, the flow of time is actually, that's also important. So we're first stepping forward in time and say, what's our directions? What's our challenge we're facing? Then we're stepping back in time, in the flow of time, and say, like, where are we right now? We would then identify a quick or small target condition that gets us closer to that direction. And then in between is a series of PDCAs and experiments that get us there. And then you see just between 3 and 1, that's also important, those little dots. Those dots get us over time into the direction. Now, the direction, number 1, might also shift over time. That's also important. So the direction is not fixed as it is in this picture right now. So over time, while we're going through multiple target conditions and experiments, we're learning about the path we're taking, and the overall path might change, most likely, as a matter of fact. We also see the rotating aspect around 4, step 4. That's also important because not every experiment is going to succeed, right? Some experiments will not lead to the desired or planned outcomes we actually had. And that's why you see a bumpy road there between 2 and 3. And that's perfectly normal. Now you can see from this picture here, and Agile Kata obviously puts a little bit something around this. We could say, I don't know if that is something we could refer as a bar to kata, is like we're actually adding something and say, hey, this is great, this works, but we're adding something to it, and like different facilitation methods. We're working in teams rather than one-on-one. We have agile coaching built in. We have agile leadership topics that go along with it. And as a result of that, we're adding ways of working to the pattern of kata, and that makes it very interesting. And obviously, your organization, this is buffet style. You would be using your techniques and your tools within your ways of working to complement this kata, and something new might come out of it. So when you're learning frameworks, for example, you will be learning certain rules, right? And with kata, you will be learning the pattern sequence, and that will create your own rules. So you would actually test those rules and see what's working rather than just applying an existing framework to a solution or using an existing transformation path for your transformation, depending on what kind of level you're using this. So just a few things I noticed in your presentation, and a few things I wanted to say, like intriguing parts about management, especially on the transformational side, especially if you're working in very large organizations, the bar works within an organization. I found that extremely important in the world of Agile to have leadership to join and actually go right to the source of where the issues are within the teams. So when you're having agile teams, so this is a nice built-in kind of mechanism within TPS, but we can learn so much from TPS, from what Ono put together in form of, hey, why don't we have leadership actually work and experience? How many leaders are coming to a daily scrum, for example, and really getting to the source of some of those impediments, question mark. What also was very intriguing was the role of a coach in Kata, the Koji Kata itself. And then obviously that is fantastic and maybe not necessarily something very new for agile teams to have an agile coach. But what I found fascinating was the role of a second coach, so that there is actually a coach of the coach. So somebody who's actually mirroring the coach. So you have a relationship between a coach and a coachee. But in addition to that, you also have a coach for the coach. And now, just to make this a little bit more complicated and even more impressive is the roles may change, right? And that is also something. It's not a superior or subordinate kind of view. So you might be a coach, I might be a coach of Hide, and in a different scenario, the same day, in a different environment, Hide might be my coach, right? It is basically just a good idea to have that kind of mirror in front of you. So also the coach and coachee relationship could swap, as well as the coach and second coach, as it's called in the literature. So I found that very important when you're working through transformation, that it's not about a personal flavor of one coach or one leader to say, we're going to go down this path. I know this is going to work and this is going to go exactly like I did it in my last company, right? Most likely it will not, because the companies and everything is different. So I find that really cool. The culture in Kata is emerging, but defining culture is very different. We can put statements, mission statements, visions out there. At the end of the day, it's the sum of the behavior of the people within an organization that are the culture and how you work this way. So Kata could be a great way of introducing culture because it's so basic, right? It's a relatively straightforward tool, as we just saw. So Kata can really help you identifying an impact on a certain way in a business process faster, right? Because you're bringing business and technology people together. You might bring people from HR and transformation coaches together. So it's really a nice mix. No silos, right? When you're doing this and you're getting more viewpoints together for creating a creative solution, and that leads to more innovation. The concept of self-organization and team empowerment is important for agile teams. And we also see that. And I think that's also maybe the fine line again. What I just learned from you, it is the bar moment, right? Because teams, self-organized teams would, and empowered teams would possibly push the boundaries and reshape their kata. So that is also a very important piece in the team. So they come together, they plan their experiments, they work through the experiments, they're defining together the next target condition. But by doing so, they're also learning about the pattern itself, the kata, and might reshape over time. But what we just saw in these previous 4 steps, it's a wonderful starting point for a team with Agile Kata. Awesome. All right. Thank you to Ide for joining us and sharing your insights here with the group. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you very much.